and if I could use a neonatal term, black people at the time that they were raising the bar and moving forward in the South, black people were subject to a violent and a ruthless onslaught by whites in the South. And it was done, probably we'll say, at the end of the first trimester of our growth. We were terminated at the first trimester of our growth, and whites violently rose up against black leadership. Whites violently and ruthlessly lynched people. Whites violently and in a very tenacious method undermined the black political power. I have here a book entitled The Colfax Massacre. And what was this about? The Colfax Massacre took place in Louisiana, where you had hundreds of black people killed. They were slaughtered. And in our video series, we'll show some video footage of the lynchings that took place, the murders that took place, the imprisonments that took place. So you see why people don't want you to know this. You see why states like Texas, Virginia, South Carolina are trying to whitewash history. They don't want the American people, they don't want this generation to know what was done to undermine black leadership. And we know what has basically spurred most of this on, the election of President Barack Obama. I think that that has done more to galvanize white solidarity and white supremacy than anything else. And when you look in history, history shows you that it is always the success of blacks that earns them the reprisals of whites, not their failures. When black people fail, history teaches. When black people fail and when black people suffer from the isms and the schisms that some believe that they're supposed to suffer from, then society will open up a door to address that issue. But when black people do succeed, when they do what the Constitution says, when they begin to assert themselves, that is when they are met with a violent onslaught so they could go back into their place. And we'll talk about the creation of the ghetto, where the ghetto comes from, who was supposed to be there, was the ghettos in America the first time those types of things take place, and who were the ones who created the ghetto. But before we go into that, I want to quote Daniel Russell, governor of North Carolina, 1904. He says, "The Negro who gets very prosperous is to be pitied, for straightway he is in a situation where danger confronts him. Let him own a fine farm, blooded horses and cattle, and dare to ride in a carriage. And if I were an insurance agent, I would not make out a policy on his life." Plain English, to get above his ordained situation. What is his ordained situation? Okay? Governor says to get above his ordained situation in life is, generally speaking, to invite assassination. Why don't we study Ida B. Wells? Why don't we know about her writings? The reason why we don't know about her is because she wrote extensively and spoke extensively on the issue of lynching. And there were so many lynchings taking place, it was hard to keep up with them. Tuskegee University has a nice archive of the lynchings in the state of Alabama. In our next video clips, or in the ones to come, we'll talk about that. But you had lynchings in Louisiana. You had massacres in Louisiana, massacres in Florida, massacres in Oklahoma, massacres in Memphis, race riots throughout the South. That was what was done to undermine black people. And so when we read in history, we see no reason to second guess the techniques or the motives, and we can also make a prediction about the future. Because I'm sure black people in the South, once they earned their rights, I don't know if they thought that things would ever change. I don't know if they thought that they would look up, and after fighting a bloody war where Americans lost more during that war than any other. The Civil War, the bloodiest war America has ever fought, the most costly war America has ever fought. I don't know if black people thought after all of that they would be subject to the re-enslavement after having gained constitutional rights. I would like our listeners, prior to viewing any or more of our videos, to do some research on the Dred Scott decision. Justice Taney in the Dred Scott decision said that black people had no rights that white people were bound to respect. And that decision was a decision that even some people are using today to justify the classification of what we call illegal immigrants. Why would Tea Partiers or so-called use or try to invoke the spirit of the Dred Scott decision to address an immigration issue today? Why are we resurrecting all of these so-called nuances that allegedly or that are supposed to represent individual rights? Why is all of this language coming up now? It's coming up now because there is a perception that black people are moving outside of the mudslide that some Southern politicians said that black people should always stay in. I want to go back to a Southern legislator. His name was James Henry Hammonds, a planter and South Carolina politician, gave a famous speech wherein on the floor of the Senate he claimed that slavery created a mudslide or a natural flaw for American society. We've heard of the 3/5 compromise, but where does that compromise come from? Where does the concept of counting a human being as being 3/5 of a person come from? It's the same concept that categorizes a fetus in the womb of the mother as being a non-human up until a certain point. And the question we have to ask is, how far do you have to go in order to be counted as a person? How far do you have to go in order to be accepted as a human being? That brings upon another issue that has emerged. And I know I'm throwing a lot of information out, but this is just an introductory. If God allows, we will continue to put this information out, and we'll take it a little slower, and our lectures will be a little more gradual, and we'll be able to take notes, and we'll be able to do the research on our own. We're not here to let you know how much we know. What we are here to do is to throw topics out so the viewer can do their own research and come to their own conclusions. The only thing that we have said is that the language of some Tea Partiers. Sharon Angle says she wants to use or would not rule out Second Amendment remedies in order to push their political point. What is the Second Amendment remedy, Sharon Angle, but what was done in the Colfax case? In the Colfax case, you had whites asserting the fact that they had the Second Amendment right and the First Amendment right and a 14th Amendment right to massacre black people. Look it up. So when you see these things, when things start getting familiar, that's when we have to begin to educate ourselves. The 3/5 compromise comes from a social theory that was being developed in Europe at the same time America was dealing with slavery. It's called, in its origin, or it's now called, the theory of social Darwinism. The survival of the fittest. What justifies one group to enslave and eliminate another group of people unless that they're inferior or accept that they be inferior? That social theory, although it was playing out in Europe, had a lot of influence on America. And the justification for white supremacy began in Europe and came across the water. But it took on more of a fertile ground in America than it did in Europe. Social Darwinism gave the right of the fittest to subdue the lesser or the supposed lesser group. And that's who we are supposed to be. This legislator here during slavery, James Henry Hammond, said that there had to be a group at the bottom that everybody else could pick on. There had to be a group that everybody else could stand on. There had to be a group who could be exploited. And that is what the architects of white supremacy